So this sort of January, we're focusing on, our theme is New Beginnings. And so the last couple of weeks have been New Beginnings and thinking about that. And Daniel, last week, he mentioned, just briefly, it wasn't his main theme at all, but he mentioned Exodus chapter 14. And just as he was sharing last week, I had no idea what I was going to share. And I was thinking, okay, what should I be sharing about? And then just really I sort of started looking at that passage more, particularly Exodus chapter 14 and Exodus chapter 15, and just really getting a little bit more in depth in that. And so this morning, that's really where I want to bring us to. And the new beginning really there is a new beginning for the Israelites. They had been in Egypt, and then God brings them out of Egypt and takes them on a journey towards the promised land. And so it's a new beginning. They've lived for over 200 years there in Egypt. They've gone through a lot of different things. At the beginning, whenever they first went to Egypt, they went there because there was no food, and then they stayed there, and it was because of Joseph. And when they were first there, they were fairly well looked after. I'm sure everything seemed to be fine. Knowing Joseph, I'm sure, was a great sort of link for them in helping them to settle into that area. But then, as time went by, the situation got worse. The Israelites multiplied, and they became a threat to the Egyptians as well, who were there. And so the Egyptians, then they started to sort of think, okay, what do we need to? We need to do something with all these Israelites that we have here. They're going to take over, and so they made them slaves, and they made them work for the Egyptian masters. And then after that, they were still growing, they were still increasing, and then Pharaoh made this decree that they would kill all the Egyptian boys as well. And so then through that story, we have Moses coming, and Moses being put in the basket, and Moses being brought up in the house of Pharaoh and brought up by Pharaoh's daughter. And so then we have Moses who comes to deliver his people. And we sort of know that story, whether you know it from the Bible or watching Prince of Egypt or whatever. But just that story of really being brought out of that situation in Egypt. And we know how hard Pharaoh's heart was in all of that. You know, one thing after the other, he kept saying, no, I'm not going to let you go. Or maybe he would say, yeah, and then straight away he would change his mind. And so finally, after the 10 plagues and the killing of the firstborn of the Egyptians, he lets them go. And so this is their sort of the start of this new journey for them, this new beginning. But straight away in their new beginning, things aren't really very easy. Whenever they first set out, they've gone a distance, and then God sort of leads them toward the Red Sea. And while this is happening, Pharaoh gets along with his advisors, and they start chatting about this. And they're thinking, what are we doing? We've just lost our whole workforce. We need to do something. And so they send the army after them. They chase after them. And so we have this story of, this massive amount of people. It said in the Bible that there was about 600,000 men alone. And then there were also women and children. So well over 1 million people sort of coming out of the land of Egypt and traveling out of the land of Egypt. And God led them towards the Red Sea through the desert that they were going in. And while they were on the way, they started, I'm sure they realized that the Egyptians were starting to pursue them. And, Daniel just mentioned a little bit last week of where the people were sort of going, what are we going to do? And Moses said, somehow God is going to deliver us. God is in control. He's going to deliver us. And then God says, just keep going, keep going. And actually, he tells Moses to raise his hand over the water, and the waters are parted. And this is just amazing, where the Israelites are able to pass through the Red Sea. And as they pass through, and they make it through to the far side, and then we have the Egyptians that come through, and as their chariots come through, the wheels come off the chariots, and then the waters come back together, and the whole Egyptian army is destroyed. And so just that picture of, I'm sure, the terror probably whenever they realized that the Egyptians were coming back after them, first of all, but then also the deliverance that the Israelites received. It was such a joyous thing for them. And it says at the end, just the end of chapter 14 in Exodus, it says, the people feared the Lord, and the whole verse, verse 31 in Exodus chapter 14, and it says, and when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him, in him and in Moses his servant. And just that beautiful picture, there's people really realized, that God was in control of all of this. And maybe, a lot had happened before that, but maybe they had a lot of fears, they had a lot of uncertainties. But now here they're at a place where they're really trusting God, they really are relying on him. And so as we go into, this picture of God drawing the people out of bondage, out of this slavery, and it's a beautiful picture, and it's a picture in many ways of, for us as well, God drawing us out of our sin, out of our own Egypt, and bringing us into his presence, bringing us into that realization of who he is and what he has done. And today I want to really look at Exodus chapter 15, which is following on from that. And most of Exodus 15 is actually a song they sang to the Lord. The first sort of 21 verses there are just a song of praise to God. And they sang this song, as they just come up out of bondage, they'd been full of praise. And this is just commemorating the victory that they had at the Red Sea. And this is an event that the psalmist never tired of celebrating. It was a great occasion within the Israelite history. And there's many psalms that actually reflect that as well, about how God released. And I was just thinking about singing. If you look at the Bible, there's over 400 commands in the Bible about singing. And this is sort of one song that we have here. But it's surprising to think that there are so many different commands. We know in the Psalms, sing to the Lord a new song, sing praise to the Lord, enter his gates with thanksgiving and with praise. There's just so many different commands to sing. For me, I love that. I love singing. I know not for everyone that's not always the case. But certainly if you know these commands and you love singing, that's a great thing to have as well. And I certainly, when I was growing up, my mum used to sing around the house, sing all sorts of choruses and praises. And I think I picked that up as well. So wherever I go, I love to be able to sing. I remember when I was about 11 or 12, working in the potato field, working alongside somebody else, and I was just singing the song that I knew. And he says, "Why do you always sing, what you're doing?" And I think it was because my mum, sort of that influence of just singing in the home and how singing was, something that really lifted the spirits. And it was actually interesting, in a survey that they did quite recently, they said that group singing can produce satisfying and therapeutic sensations, even when the sound is actually really mediocre. It's not so much the sound, which I'm very thankful about. And that's why the Bible says to make a joyful noise unto the Lord. It's not make a great sounding noise, but really to make a joyful noise. And I try to do that. And God knows, some people have more of a gift of singing than others, but we're all called to make a joyful noise. And it's interesting, actually, the last time I preached just over a month ago here, I was focusing on another song as well, the song that the angels sang, the multitude of the angels sang whenever they appeared to the shepherds before going to see Jesus in Bethlehem. And so just keeping that in mind, here in Exodus chapter 15, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people singing this song together. And just that amazing, I was thinking, imagine hearing them all singing this in the far side of the Red Sea, just singing there in the desert, and this praise to God, this orchestra. I don't know how tuneful it was, but it certainly would have sounded reverberating around that whole valley and where they were. And can you imagine how stirring that would be? Here we have a whole nation singing praise to God. And I was thinking as well, we can happily go along to a concert or something else. And, like last summer I went to a U2 concert. You have 80,000 people there. And it's interesting, like the band, because people know all the songs. The band stops singing, and then the crowd just sing, like 80,000 people just singing the songs, and it's just very, very powerful. And maybe the same way, I used to go to quite a few soccer matches, go somewhere like Manchester, Old Trafford or something, and you've got 60, 70,000 just singing the songs there as well. And it's very powerful as well, even though sometimes the lyrics are not the most savory, but just, that singing together and that praising together. And I was thinking about that. that just the beautiful picture of that singing together, that praising together, it's about how much more special it is to come together to sing biblical truths. And I thought just what a beautiful picture this is here. We have in Exodus chapter 15 of just singing and praising God and all of that. Let's maybe look at this passage and look at the song of Moses and Miriam. So we're going to read from Exodus chapter 15 and verse 1. And I'm going to read the whole way through to verse 21. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your great hand, O Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood firm like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy boasted, I will pursue, I will overtake them. I will divide the spoils, I will gorge myself on them. I will draw my sword, and my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who among the gods is like you, O God? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall upon them. By the power of your arm, they will be as still as a stone, until your people pass by, O Lord, until the people you bought pass by. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance. The place, O Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, your hand established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the water of the sea back over them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with tambourines and dancing. Miriam sang to them, Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he is hurled into the sea. And so here we have this song. It's really a song of victory for the battle that has been won, for what God has done during that time. Lots of sort of celebration of just this amazing miracle that has happened. But I just wanted to pick up some things from this passage that particularly I think we can just see and the significance. And the first thing on that is, if you look at the beginning, it's talking about the Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. Just thinking about God's strength. We look back, at this verse and sort of think, this is what the Israelites have just experienced. They've seen God's strength. They've seen his power. They've seen it manifest in the parting of the waters at the Red Sea. They've seen the pursuers, the Egyptians, being wiped out. And that must have, for them, they've lived in Egypt. They've seen the power, they've seen the might of the Egyptians over many years. And they, I'm sure, were terrified by them in many ways and didn't see how they could possibly overcome them. And yet they've seen the strength of God in this situation. And I think, as they sang that, the Lord is my strength and my song, he has become my salvation. I was just thinking, we at the same time today in 2018 can sing that same thing. We're not getting rescued from Egyptians or armies coming to, but in the same way, the Lord is our strength. He is our song. He is our salvation. And we have salvation, of course, because of him and what he has done. But that's not all they're celebrating here. They're celebrating the personal intervention and action of the Lord. If you look at verse 6, it says, "Your right hand, O Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger. It consumed them like stubble." And as it goes on there, the song clearly distinguishes between the power of God and the power of man. You can hear it here in the verse. It says, your right hand, O Lord, was majestic. Your right hand, the greatness of your majesty. It's God who's done this. The Israelites are very aware that they haven't done anything in this situation. It's actually been God who has done these things. He has made it happen. And it's so different from when you look about in verse 9, it says, "The enemy boasted, I will pursue, I will overtake them, I will divide the spoils, I will gorge myself on them, I will draw my sword, and my hand will destroy them." So it was all, this is what we're going to do, we're going to destroy you. And yet God is so much more powerful than all of that. And I love it as it goes into verse 10. "But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them." It just seems such a simple thing that God sort of blew, and that was the solution. And yet all this might of the armies of the Egyptians were just wiped out, just like that. And we see how different it is from the enemy's boasting. And then we see, as you go on, it's not just that personal intervention, that action. It's not just his strength, but they're also celebrating his victory over other gods, his victory over the earth, his victory over everything, that God is all-powerful in all that he does. And here we say, you see in verse 11 to 13, let's just look at that. And it says, "Who among the gods is like you, O God? Who is like you?" And of course, the Egyptians had their gods. All the other nations that they were going to come in contact with, they had their gods as well. But he says, "Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them." And so we have, of course, we have this God who is holy, this God who is powerful, and that he stretched out his hand. And these are things that would have been, the Almighty God. This is characteristics of him. But I think there's something here that is different as well, something that is actually maybe something hadn't been seen before. If you think about God, it goes on to say, "In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed." And so with many of the other gods, they would have had this power, or people would have assumed this power, or even this holiness and that reverence that you had to have for them. And the holiness is just that's being set apart and being different from. But here we have God who is actually a God of love as well, a God who really cares. And that's the difference from maybe other gods that there would have been. And as we look a little bit down this passage as well, we see further on in verse 14 through to 18, it goes through the list of all the different nations that will tremble, those who are going to be afraid of them. And we just think about where God has, they have seen God's victory in the past, they see his victory now, and they're also saying, "God, because of who you are, because of your strength, because we know you can intervene, that you're also going to intervene in the future." Whether, and the whole way through, it mentions the different places of Moab, on the way through to the land, the promised land, to Canaan, in all of that. And, you remember that the Israelites have seen the great nation of Egypt defeated, and for them, they knew how powerful Egypt was. And they realized as well that it wasn't because of the revolt of the slaves. It wasn't because the slaves had somehow overcome the Egyptians, but rather it was like one natural disaster after another natural disaster after another natural disaster. And so of course, whenever people would hear about that, Egypt was sort of perceived as the most powerful nation. And whenever they heard that all God had done, of course they would tremble and they would be fearful because of all that had happened there. And so it wasn't really that the other nations were afraid of the Israelites. The Israelites weren't the most scary army around, but really they were terrified of the God of the Israelites. They realized the power that God had in all of that. They believed that the God of the Israelites was on the Israelites' side. Whenever they realized that God wasn't there, when he wasn't with the Israelites, they suddenly got brave. They wanted to fight the Israelites. But whenever they realized that God was there, we see all kinds of things happening. They're running away, fighting each other, just confusion happening in their ranks because God was in control of all those things. And so really we have them here, the Israelites singing about this future victory. And so yeah, I just think it's amazing to see sort of how, the Israelites realized all of this. They're singing these truths about what God has done. And we know as well, we can come here and we can sing these truths about God. God has the victory over everything. God is in control of all things. He will help us in the future with all the trials and all the challenges that come. That should give us a security that we are children of God, that we are secure, that our future is secure. I know that we have God's strength. We have His presence with us wherever we are and whatever we're doing. He is working it all out for His glory, and we may not fully understand how that is, or even the way it happens may not be something that we really understand. But yeah, we can certainly have faith and trust in God. And then, as in this passage, we have first of all Moses and the whole Israelites singing this song. Then we have Miriam going around with the tambourine, praising God as well, with all of the women following her and dancing. And you can just imagine, after all they've been through, all the oppression, all the challenges they've been through, just going and praising God, and really the weight that's been lifted off their shoulders after all these years of oppression and all the challenges and slavery that they've had. But really what I wanted to sort of look at a little bit more, it's great you see this praising of God. And I read this last week and go, wow, yeah, they've seen so much, they've understood now what God is, how exciting that is. But then you go on to verse 22, and you sort of think, okay, how did that happen? How did you go from sort of all that praising God to what happens then in verse 22? So let's look at Exodus chapter 15, verse 22 through to the end. It says, Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, What are we to drink? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Then the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there He tested them. He said, If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right, if you pay attention to His commands and keep all His decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. And so here we have this passage. They now are coming to the desert. And so, the thought is, would the joy of the deliverance and the knowledge that God gave them, that inner strength to face the trials that lay ahead, would that stay with them, or what would happen? It is easy for any of us to sing when things are going well, but it is a challenge to sometimes sing and be really joyful when things are not going in the same way, when difficulties come, when challenges come. And we know as we read through the story of the Israelites going through the desert, there were many trials, many challenges that came their way during that time. And so they were on their way to the promised land, but it was going to be a very difficult journey for them. It was a journey when they would have disappointments. They would have many sort of situations where they would not have that joy of victory. And so just looking at that, I was thinking of some of the things that we can learn through this story. And so often, after great victories, they're sometimes followed by great challenges, great problems that we have, if you think about this. And, the text says here that Moses led the Israelites from the Red Sea, and they traveled in the desert without finding water. And you can imagine just a few days in the desert, how hard that was going to be. I was just picturing, the relief they finally had whenever they got and they saw that there could be something. It says when they came to Marah, they found some water, but imagine, the disappointment there would have been whenever they realized that the water couldn't be drank at all there. And, so first of all, their hopes had rose, and then they were dashed again because the water was too bitter for them to drink. But we can see here that the problems as well as the victories can be used by God if we look at this passage, we see how he uses this to teach the Israelites a lesson. And God is able to turn the bitter water sweet. And verse 23 says, now they came to Marah. They could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah. And Marah basically means bitterness. And they plunged their faces into the water to quench their thirst. I'm sure they just couldn't wait. And then they realized it was not water they could drink at all. It wasn't poisonous, but it just was so unpleasant. It was something they couldn't drink. And so it was called the waters of bitterness. And so, when it became apparent that their hopes for relief from thirst were in vain, you see how they react. I think it's easy for us to be very critical when we read stories in the Bible. We always know the end of the story, and we think, how could they not have trusted God? Surely they knew he was going to provide. And yet, in the space of 3 days, if you think about it, 3 days of traveling in the desert, they've gone from actually praising God to starting to grumble and mumble again and saying, how are you going to provide? What's going on, Moses? It says, so the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what are we to drink? And, you can think about it. Here we have many young children. If you have young children, and you know how they can be moaning and groaning too, and how hard it is to keep them happy. And so you have this whole multitude of people. It's not just a few hardened warriors, but it's that whole situation of people that are traveling, and just how unbearable it probably would have been for them with a few days without water. And so it's not surprising that in some ways they were unhappy, but the way they responded was not the way that God wanted them to respond in this situation. And it shows how short their memories were. And I think for us, we can also often have very similar short memories where we really forget God's faithfulness and what he has done. And so life is made up of, highs and lows. And the question is, how will we react when the low times come, when the things are not quite going right for us? Who will we seek help from? And so we see that when we grumble and we really shows our lack of faith, we don't turn to who we should be turning to in all of this. In verse 24, it says, they cried out and the people complained against Moses. We look at that verse. And, Moses there, over many, many years, he gets the grumblings and the mumblings of the people where they're just not happy with the situation and what's going on. But it tells us just how disillusioned, how disappointed they were in this whole situation. Instead of turning to God in prayer and trust, they assumed that just this problem was unsolvable, that there was no way forward. And even though they'd seen God's working in such an amazing way, how can you go from saying, God, you're so amazing, you're so strong, you're going to defeat all the enemies that we have going ahead, and then just a few days later, hey, what's going on? There's no solution here to this situation just because we can't get water and all of that. And so God, uses this trial to teach them a great lesson. And thankfully, Moses, and often when they turned to Moses, he was the one who brought them back to God. He was the one who was able to remember God's faithfulness and trust in all of that. And if you look at verse 25, it says, Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. And then says, then the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there he tested them. And in this situation, God showed Moses, a nearby desert tree, and told him to cut off a branch and throw it into the water. Here he asks Moses to do by faith something that, again, we see often God will ask Moses to do something that seems really, I'm sure when he was asked to stretch his hand out over the water, that would seem strange. Whenever he was going to, in front of Pharaoh, there were many things that Moses was asked, but whenever he was asked, he was faithful to do those things. And this was just to take a bit of wood and to throw it into the water. And you wouldn't think that that would make any difference, but because he trusted God in that solution, he saw God work, and the problem was solved in that. And in this situation, Moses showed that he trusted fully in God. He still was fully trusting. Of course, he had seen God, and God had really confirmed to him through his bringing him to lead the people, just that he was a God who could be fully depended on. But the people still hadn't fully got this lesson. They hadn't really fully worked that out. And we see here that God rebuked their lack of faith among the people of Israel and told them that it had been a test. But it was not God here who was on trial. It was a test of the people, a test that we could easily see that they failed again. And many times there are tests that come to them and they failed. But God uses these circumstances to show the children of Israel what was in their hearts. He said to them in verse 26, he said, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. And so we have here this piece of wood, or in some versions it says log, in some versions it says tree in the desert. But even for us, I think it's an encouraging symbol. If you think about it as well, God showed Moses this tree, and it was cast into the water, and the water took away the bitterness that was there. The Lord revealed to us another tree, of course. I was thinking about it in the way that God used that tree, but also he died on the cross, that tree at Calvary, in the same way for us, and that we could be totally renewed, refreshed, and restored to him in the same way as the water was restored to water that was fit to eat. The bitterness was taken away. And I think often in our lives there can be things that come in our lives that causes bitterness, whether it's challenges, relationships with others, just things that can really weigh heavily on us. But God can use those experiences to make them sweet. As the psalmist discovered in his own life, he said, weeping may endure for a day, but joy comes in the morning. And I think there is a danger in our lives that things can become, we can come to situations, whether bitterness or problems in our lives, that can really challenge us, that can really just cause us, to make that decision. Do we really trust God in this? Do we cry out to him? Do we see how he works? Or do we just somehow succumb to it, or let that bitterness somehow dwell in our hearts? Are we going to see that water being restored, refreshed in our lives? And I was thinking about this. I was thinking about the story. It's a story I read when I was younger. And it's the story of Corrie ten Boom. And I think most of you may have heard of Corrie ten Boom. And the story of Corrie ten Boom is the book. There's a book, The Hiding Place, and there's also a film that I remember watching when I was young. And the story of Corrie ten Boom is actually a story that, really moving story. Corrie ten Boom was 47 in 1939. That was the start of the Second World War. And with Corrie ten Boom, she was living with her sister and with her widowed father, and he was 82, aging, and they were living in the Netherlands. And at this time, the war had started, and there was a lot of, particularly the Jews were being persecuted, and so they started actually harboring the Jews in their home. They had a secret room in their house there in Haarlem, and they would bring people in and they would hide the Jews, and so that they wouldn't get taken away and deported. And so after a period of time, the inevitable happened. In 1944, all of the family were captured, and they were taken away and sent to concentration camps. And so we had Corrie ten Boom and her sister Betsy. They were taken to this concentration camp. And at the concentration camp, they suffered, there was really extreme conditions there. But the one thing that brought Corrie sort of solace and relief in that situation was that she had a Bible. She had hidden a Bible, and she was able to read that Bible. And that really encouraged her. And it also encouraged the other ladies there in the prison, in the camp. And and so that Bible really enabled her, as she read her Bible, during that period of time, she grew so much in her faith, actually being there in that prison and really trusting God and learning more about God in all of that. But their time in the prison, it wasn't easy. Her sister died during her time there in the prison, and they just endured extreme circumstances as they were there. But then somehow, by a miracle, Corrie was released on New Year's Day in 1945. And so she was released, and soon after the war ended, and she then went out and started doing sharing and doing evangelism, and really just sharing her faith and talking about the love of God with people, and particularly talking about forgiveness. And of course, she had plenty to forgive through all the situations that had happened there. The different prison guards were just really had treated them very roughly and all of that. But I just was wanting to share just a very short part from that. I was just reading this last week, just reminded again. These are just Corrie's own words about an experience that she had when she went to a church in Munich. And so it says here, I was at a church service in Munich when I saw him, the former SS man who had stood guard at the shower room door in the processing centre at Ravensbrück. He was the first of our actual jailers that I had seen since that time. And suddenly it was all there, all the memories. He came up to me as the church was emptying, beaming and bowing. How grateful I am for your message, Fräulein, he said. Do you think that, as you say, he has washed my sins away? His hand was thrust out to shake mine. And I, who had preached so often to people the need to forgive, kept my hand at my side. Even as the angry, vengeful thoughts boiled through me, I saw the sin of them. Jesus Christ had died for this man. Was I going to ask for more? Lord Jesus, I prayed, forgive me and help me to forgive him. I tried to smile. I struggled to raise my hand. I could not. I felt nothing, not the slightest spark of warmth or charity. And so again I breathed the silent prayer. Jesus, I cannot forgive him. Give me your forgiveness. As I took his hand, the most incredible thing happened. From my shoulder, along my arm, and through my hand, a current seemed to pass from me to him, while into my heart sprang a love for this stranger that almost overwhelmed me. And so I discovered that it was not on our forgiveness any more than on our goodness that the world's healing hinges, but on his. When he tells us to love our enemies, he gives, along with the command, the love itself. And I was just very struck by that story. And it's very easy for us to talk about things like forgiveness and even that situation of just bitterness that we might harbor. But just seeing how God, we need to totally trust God, that he is the solution in all of that, that he will help, he'll help us to love our enemies. He gives us that command, and he will give us that love to be able to carry that out as well. And so just as we come to the end of our time here, I was just really thinking that, there may be struggles in our lives, there may be challenges in our life, there may be things that are really dragging us down. It may be just bitterness towards others in our relationships. And whatever it is, we need to trust God and let them go, release them fully to him. And just as we go on to, you see the last verses here, in verse 27 it says, they then came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. And so God had given them this test of the people, and then he brings them back to this place of blessedness. And so here we have this grumbling people who really had turned away from God, and complaining about all the situation, and yet God provided them the sweet water in their lives to drink. He provided them with shade, 12 springs and 70 palm trees. In the midst of the desert, in the midst of their grumbling, he still showed his love towards them. I was just thinking, I have no idea, what's going to come your way in 2018. There might be new beginnings. Things might just be the same as they have been before. But as you go into the year, are you starting off with that singing of praise to God? Are you praising him for who he is, for his strength, his victory over death, for his, that he knows what's going to happen in the future? Are you really trusting him in all of this? Or are you sort of celebrating and praising him today, and then Monday comes, Tuesday comes, situations happen in life, and we sort of lose all that joy, we lose all that all that praising of God, and we actually just start to mumble or grumble? Or is there just something in our life that's constantly stopping us from really fully knowing God because of that bitterness or harboring unforgiveness in our lives? Are we going to grumble and complain, or are we going to fully trust in God in all of that? Not everything in our life is going to be sweet. Life, there will be challenges, there will be bitter things, there will be sweet things in all of that. But it's not the circumstances, it's about that trusting in God in the midst of all of that we go through. Rather than complaining, we need to turn to God, we need to seek him, we need to trust him for the solutions, believing that he is able to control and he is able to is in charge of all those things. And then that God would bring us into that place of rest as well. So just, I was just been looking at this passage, been struck by it this week, struck by how easy it is to praise in 1 minute and to turn away and grumble the next minute. And I can often do that. I can really be rejoicing so much and then just realize, how I've just totally lost my focus. I've taken my eyes off God. I'm no longer really praising him. And I'm actually just mumbling and grumbling in that situation. So that's just an encouragement as we go through this year to keep coming back to God, keep trusting in him, not trusting him just in our Sundays or in our good days, but trusting him through the challenges and through the hard times as well.